Myself and a team of several propaganda model scholars were in a discussion group, and out of that, the initiative which I led was to write an article about all of the things the mainstream media won't say about Western foreign policy. We decided to pitch this article to lots of different newspapers. Now, what's going to be the likely result of that? They're going to say no. However, there was one place which I had previously written for, which is called The Conversation, and they accepted the pitch, which was, for example, there was a report that came out saying sanctions on Venezuela have killed 40,000 Venezuelans. And this was not reported. The UN report very clearly said this isn't because the Venezuelan government is rubbish at the economy. This is because the Trump administration is preventing dialysis machines and cancer and HIV medication from going across the border. It was accepted by The Conversation as a pitch. They were excited about it. It was going to go out on a Thursday morning, 2019. The executive editor then came in for a last minute check. And then an hour later, the whole project had effectively been scrapped. You know, he'd removed any reference that we had to Venezuela. He'd removed any reference to Vietnam. He'd removed all references to East Timor and Indonesia. He'd even removed the references to ourselves being scholars of propaganda theory. I did feel like it was a good reflection of the propaganda model in action.
This is the MMT Podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Hi, I'm Christian Riley and welcome to the Modern Monetary Theory Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you can support the show by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. At the beginning there, you heard author, documentary filmmaker, and lecturer in media, Dr. Matthew Alford. And I'm going to be talking to him in a moment about understanding mass media as an institution and relating that to coverage of modern monetary theory. If you're new to MMT, you can listen to our first 3 episodes for an introduction, but if you want to dive in here, it's a framework for understanding how money as we know it today comes into being, moves through, and exits what we call the economy. To be a bit more specific, let's look at government spending. Every year, the government spends some money to hire people and buy things to provision the NHS or the armed forces or the education system or to build and maintain transport infrastructure. And in that same time period, the government taxes some money away from individuals and firms in the private sector. Now, given the way we experience money as individuals, it's natural to assume that the government is taking taxes off people to pay for the things I just mentioned. But a closer analysis of the institutions involved in government spending reveals that the sequence is not that the government takes money off people and firms and then spends that money to provision itself, it's the other way around. Because the government is the source of the money we use, the government spends first and then we have the money we need to pay our taxes back to them. A currency issuing government cannot run out of its own money. So given that tens of thousands of people have died in the UK alone in the last decade or so as a result of austerity policies and much larger numbers globally, MMT proponents are often motivated by wanting to prevent any more of this wholly unnecessary suffering. But because it's a less than superficial idea to communicate, people who are ideologically opposed to certain types of government spending have a huge home field advantage in our culture. Scholars have networks of relationships and personal reputations to protect. Media organizations have to maintain their access to prominent, ratings-friendly, but often intellectually overripe economic commentators. So people at the individual level and organizations at the institutional level are incentivized against reconsidering the orthodox thinking they've been working with. And after all, if their thinking doesn't change and if the world doesn't change, who suffers? Just the people who historian Mark Curtis calls unpeople. And if they die, literally becoming unpeople, well, we must have meant well, but poverty is just something that happens, like the weather. But when you consider that governments such as those of the UK, the US, Japan, Canada, and Australia, to name a few, are the sources of their respective nations' currencies, you understand that poverty isn't a random thing that just happens. It's a conscious policy choice, and this drives many of us to want to spread that understanding of our money system and make it urgent. And I think where fresh ideas get vetoed by mass media is in their selection of, let's call them, experts. Because of the size, concentrated ownership, owner wealth, and profit orientation of the dominant mass media firms, it's fair to say that the news organizations creating the content consumed by most of us are part of the establishment and therefore are not really in the best position to critique it. So, to keep the apple cart firmly upright without conceding that obvious point, the experts that make it onto TV more than once need to give the air of someone who is very incisive and unafraid of challenging establishment thinking without actually subverting establishment thinking. And this often means the poles of debate can get fixed between quite a narrow range of ideas. For instance, the way this manifests itself in Western foreign policy journalism is that there is ferocious debate, but the poles of that debate are set between two positions. The first position is intervention X was warranted because defenseless country Y was a clear and present danger. And then there's the opposing view, which is intervention X wasn't warranted, but it was an unfortunate and costly blunder where we accidentally fooled ourselves into thinking defenseless country Y was a clear and present danger. We meant well, we'll never do it again, unless of course we absolutely have to, and unfortunately now we'll have to stay the distance. Sadly, we've just run out of time to describe what operational success looks like in this case. Now here's Bob with the sports. In countries where people generally love peace and liberty and are relatively free to vote how they like and use the power of protest to advance their agenda, it's important to the credibility and multiple streams of revenue of news media outlets to make their audiences feel as if their commentary is insightful, cantankerous, and unrestricted. So they need to make people feel that there's a debate going on, but have them not notice that the question being debated is, who's right, the imperialist or the well-meaning imperialist? And I think in economic commentary we see the same kind of fixing of the poles of debate. Who's right, the deficit hawk or the deficit dove? The austerity proponent or the well-meaning austerity proponent? Now, when you consider that an academic study published in 2017 linked 120,000 deaths to austerity here in the UK, I think it's fair to say that if we were defenceless country Y, our government killing 120,000 of its own people would be grounds for intervention X. So in a moment, I'll be talking to Matthew about the things that shape mass media narratives. In the show notes, I've linked to where you can follow Matthew's work and to some other excellent media criticism projects that we didn't get around to talking about in this conversation. And as ever, I've linked to where you can support this podcast financially via patreon.com/MMTpodcast. Support starts at $1 a month or £1 a month or whatever the equivalent is wherever you live. And no matter what level of support you give, you get early access to all of our episodes and patron-only episodes where you can ask me and Patricia MMT questions. We're 100% listener funded. Your financial support really helps keep the show going, and your support in other ways, whether it's by recommending us to other people or just by listening and spreading the word about this stuff, really helps too. A big thank you to all of our supporters so far, and thanks as ever for the time you put into understanding MMT. Let's dive in. Welcome one and all to the MMT podcast. I'm Christian Riley. Unfortunately, my co-host Patricia is away this week, but joining me today is author, documentary filmmaker, and lecturer in media, Dr. Matthew Alford. Hi, Matthew. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Christian.
The reason I wanted to talk to Matthew today is because I thought it would be valuable for people communicating with journalists such as MMT proponents. I thought it'd be a good idea for us to understand the mass media as a system, which is what Matthew's work is about, But before I get into that, I'm just going to say that I became interested in this stuff in about 2003 when I went to the London protest against the invasion of Iraq. And it was an international protest. But in London, there were more than 1 million people there. Some say possibly 2 million. But the thing that struck me was that the people there seemed to be from all different backgrounds and different ages and different minority groups. There were people from religious groups, people who were part of political groups. But most people were there, like me, without any outwardly visible affiliation. And given the size of the crowd, inevitably, I imagine people who felt no connection to the left or the anti-war movement. But we were all united in this view that it was wrong for our government to start bombing Iraq and inevitably killing civilians. And I saw that strength of feeling across all these different people. And I felt, crucially, I felt not alone, and that this was quite a mainstream opinion to hold, which if I was only experiencing this issue through the news media up until that day, I'd have thought that I'm the only person in the world who thinks this. So anyway, I get home and I turn on the news and I'm thinking that the demo might not have an impact on the decision to invade Iraq, but it might have changed the conversation a little bit, maybe on TV. And so I start looking at the news, and first of all, they play down the numbers and they treat it as unimportant. And then later in the opinion pages of The Guardian and The Observer, the sort of nominally progressive media, it's just one pro-war voice after another. The countervailing view is virtually absent. And that's when I knew something was up with the media, and that actually there isn't a cantankerous press questioning narratives being put out by our government, and that a certain part of the spectrum of opinion wasn't being represented at all. And that led me to want to learn about why that was. So when people say, oh, protests don't do anything, I think that was actually the beginning of my life starting to have meaning. And that's when a friend of mine said to me, oh, look, if you want to understand why this is happening, you should read Noam Chomsky, Edward Herman, Media Lens. And that's how I began to develop what I found to be a useful way to understand media. Turning to you, Matthew, can you remember a moment like that that got you interested in media, or was it more the case that you were just already interested in media and it got into learning about it more formally because the interest was already there?
I'm not sure about media, because I think media is so inseparable from politics that it's almost like, when did you start engaging in politics in a particular way? Because the media is just such a close association with that. So I think that I suppose really I started to become very concerned about politics in the late 90s, because it became apparent that the possible benefits from the end of the Cold War were not going to be realized, and in fact that the world was moving towards a much darker and more dangerous international system. And that's sort of what bothered me. And then there were the rise, and then particularly by the end of the 90s, there were the emergence of these quite frightening and sinister wars. For example, the ongoing bombing of Iraq and the sanctions against Iraq, which were killing a lot of people. The numbers are very much disputed, but large numbers of people were dying as a result of Western intervention, or non-intervention, however you want to call it. But these things were kind of off the table. News coverage in the United States had dropped precipitously, even though the public wanted to have international news. Their international news was dipping. And so all those things combined, I think, made me recognize that the media was really fundamental. And I guess Chomsky was a key part of that. I mean, some of the earliest books that I ever bought on politics were Noam Chomsky, World Orders, Old and New. I think there was one. I just remembered the first time I ever used the internet. And it was probably, I think I was 8. I think it might have been my 18th birthday for some reason. And we went to an internet cafe, which is what was cool then. And I remember, we only had half an hour to use the internet for the first time. And the two things I looked up were, I only had time to look up two things. One was I looked up conspiracy theories. And the other thing I looked up was the Sisters of Mercy lyrics. And I spent probably equal time on both of those projects.
I bet that put you straight on some watch list. Militant goths. A sleeper cell. You're going to be all right if the sun's out, but if it ever gets overcast, he's going to rise up.
In those days, that was 1995-6. In those days, if you typed in conspiracy theories, you used to get these websites. But one of them that came up was called "What Uncle Sam Really Wants." And it sounded like a crazy conspiracy, but actually that was just the title. And the article was by Noam Chomsky. In fact, it was a book by Noam Chomsky, one of his more sort of obscure ones from the 80s, I think, What Uncle Sam Really Wants. And so I printed that out, and I got into Chomsky that way. One of the things about Chomsky is that he really despises conspiracy theories. But actually I got into Noam Chomsky's own work because I literally Yahoo'd, or whatever the heck the search engine was at the time, conspiracy theories, and because he had packaged his work in such a way, or given it such a kind of sexy and sinister title, it led me into his work, which is very much opposed to conspiracy theories. It's about systematic analysis of institutions. That's how I sort of got into politics. And because Chomsky's talking about both politics and media as something almost inseparable, the political economy of the mass media is the subheading of Manufacturing Consent, his most famous book. Then it kind of just inevitably led to that. And then as a kind of adjunct to that, if you like, because I was so fundamentally interested in Chomsky's perspective, ultimately that led me to question, well, if the mass media is doing this, is manufacturing consent, if the mass media, the news media, is representing war in this particular way and other issues that are meaning that it is a fundamental part of the establishment rather than a critique of the establishment, then what are the implications for entertainment? And that led me to doing postgraduate work primarily about the role that entertainment systems, particularly Hollywood, have in within that system. And the result of that is that they're very similar. They fulfill a very similar role.
It becomes more important. You've got half a chance of understanding that if you read the Sun newspaper, even if you are a Sun newspaper reader, you've got half a chance of understanding that it's published by somebody with an agenda. Likewise, The Guardian. Whereas entertainment media, the agenda is not so explicit.
Yeah, there's definitely a danger of that. But I think that's kind of an imponderable. To know the exact effects of particular kinds of media is really hard to tease out. But it's definitely really important, and and I don't know if you need to tie things down a great deal more than to say that it's clearly very important, but you can't necessarily measure it.
Yeah, but there's also this thing where, if you had a lot of money to influence opinion, obviously you could take out ads. People know that it's an ad. If you're really, really clever, you could hire a PR firm to have news stories placed that espouse the benefits of your, cigarette brand. To take something. I choose that, and a lot of people do when they look at this thing. They choose cigarettes because obviously we look back and we go, it's quite obviously a bad thing for people's health, but over the years it's been sold as a good thing, even a healthy thing.
You could have the biggest impact from actually quite a small thing. Just one example comes to mind, which I'm sure you'll know because it's kind of a textbook case, but it was the early propagandists with cigarettes providing them to women. Have you come across that before? The idea of just providing cigarettes for a few photographs of high society women, because previously only men smoked and it was gross for the idea for women to smoke. That's pretty. I mean, I don't know how much money was invested in that, but it wouldn't have been much. And that's a targeted fulcrum point. It's like, when you take an example of conflict. So the example from 1990, where a 15-year-old girl talked about the baby incubator story. I'll rush through it because I think you will be vaguely familiar with it at the very least.
No, don't rush through it.
Okay, hang on. And so, this is the story of the Kuwaiti girl who saw Kuwaiti babies being thrown out of incubators by the invading Iraqi army, Saddam Hussein's army. And
this is Gulf War One, by the way.
Gulf War One, and they were, and she said they were left on the cold stone floor to die, and she was a witness, and it was, and this was an atrocity story. And spoiler alert, I'm about to reveal that it was a falsified one, ruining my story. But the girl turned out to be the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to the United States. And she had been trained to tell her story by Hill and Knowlton, the second most powerful PR firm, the second biggest PR firm at the time. And she provided this testimony anonymously on the Hill as a way to persuade the United States to intervene militarily. In 1990, there was the Parliament was split on whether it should intervene militarily, partly because the West had been so closely allied with Saddam Hussein, but also partly for strategic reasons. Do you really want to send in an army to kick out for a relatively small invasion? They're kind of allied with us and so on. Vietnam, and also the idea of, at the time at least, America was still haunted by the ghost of Vietnam and didn't really want to be getting involved in all that. But this girl's testimony, Naraya, as she was called, tipped the balance there. Now, again, that may have cost millions of dollars, but not much in the grand scheme of things. That is something that had an enormous impact that still resonates today, but was at a particularly decisive, important moment. At which there was this kind of a fulcrum point, if you like. Maybe this is just a sort of inherent nature of reality comment, but small changes can make huge impacts within society, and that's partly because opinion is often split quite closely. So those kind of differences, when you're talking about knife edge decisions, where it could be a 40-60 or 60-40, let alone 48-52 split. The media, in terms of policing discourse, can be extremely important. That doesn't mean that the media itself can necessarily impact loads and loads of people, but under the kind of political circumstances where we find ourselves, where there are often these split decisions, I think it is really, really important.
So we're going to get to that structural analysis of the mass media in a minute, but you recently had an editorial run-in trying to get a story published, which, puts a human face on those structural problems. Can you tell us that story?
Yeah, so myself and a team of several propaganda model scholars, so they are academics, are in we're in a discussion group, and out of that, the initiative which I led was to write, or one of the initiatives was to write an article about all of the things that the mainstream media won't say about Western foreign policy. So we decided to pitch this article to lots of different newspapers. Now, what's going to be the likely result of that? They're going to say no, because it's saying these are the things that you haven't done properly when covering American and British foreign policy. And so it was really predictable that everyone was going to say no. However, there was one place which I had previously written for, which is called The Conversation. And The Conversation is a website which is well known at universities because it uses academics as their sources instead of journalists. And then out of that, The Conversation gives the resultant news stories that it commissions to lots of newspapers. So, for example, I've been published in The Independent a couple of times because I've written for The Conversation. So they have got an obligation to work with academics, and they accepted the pitch that I sent to them, which was saying, look, this is what the mainstream media don't say about British and American foreign policy. These are the things that are omitted. And so we gave lots of examples of this. I'll just maybe say one or two. So, for example, the Trump administration put sanctions on Venezuela. And there was a report that came out saying sanctions on Venezuela have killed 40,000 Venezuelans in 2017 into 2018. And this was not reported anywhere except for one newspaper article was mentioned in The Independent. But other than that, it was not reported in the British press. I think that's quite an interesting example of where, you know, a really obvious policy is clearly killing lots of people, and it surely cannot be of any benefit to any ordinary person around the world to know that we've participated in the death of 40,000 people. And it was also extremely clear, like the report, the UN report very clearly said that this isn't because the Venezuelan government is rubbish at the economy. This is because the Trump administration is preventing dialysis machines and cancer and HIV medication from going across the border. Like, it's a really horrible thing to do. And then it was poorly reported. Another example was going back historically. And so we looked at the reporting on the Vietnam conflict. So all the examples we used were basically from early 1960s to the present day. And the Vietnam War, Chomsky was a particularly famous and vociferous critic because although lots of people didn't like the idea of the US fighting in Vietnam because it was costing a lot of American troops primarily, Chomsky was one of these few people who said, well, look, we're not even there to defend South Vietnam. And even the peaceniks were saying, well, we're there to defend South Vietnam, but we're doing it really badly. Chomsky said, no, we're there to attack South Vietnam. We are destroying South Vietnam. And no one can see that because as a society we're so blinded ideologically. And so we went through some of the literature on that, and it's true. Like, no one said, except for Chomsky, who didn't have any media outlet as an organ through which he could put across his views, any mainstream outlet. So that was one of these clear cases of a kind of a total inversion of the truth. And how no one had commented in a particular way. So we tried to find these most stark cases possible, and the most up-to-date examples possible as well. Anyway, one of the things it was accepted by The Conversation as a pitch. They were excited about it. They ended up, the editor put together a headline. It was going to go out on a Thursday morning, 2019. The headline was going to be how Western media support state terror while millions die. And the picture that they'd put with that was, I think, an American with coming out the top of a tank with a machine gun. And it was really well put together, partly because the Conversation has software, which means that that helps you to you write it all collectively online. And the software is for grammar and simplification of language. Now, some people may not like that, but actually it meant that, you know, we were scoring really high in terms of readability. So the piece was really good. And they'd packaged it really well. Anyway, the upshot of it was that the executive editor then came in for a last minute check, and then an hour later the whole project had effectively been scrapped. And that was on the grounds that the executive editor basically just didn't like it, and sort of had written all over it in caps, saying things like, you can't say this about Libya without saying how bad Colonel Gaddafi is. He'd removed any reference that we had to Venezuela. He'd removed any reference to Vietnam. He'd removed all references to East Timor and Indonesia. He'd even removed the references to ourselves being scholars of propaganda theory. It was hard to have, if it had been in the olden days, it would have been the typewriter, and it would have been the screwing up the piece of paper and throwing it in the bin in the New York Times. But in this case, he literally screwed up an entire computer and threw it in a bin. It was a comprehensive no, and it was so clear that it was along political lines that. Yeah, but at the same time, they were still holding out the possibility of it being fine, and so we engaged in all of their questions, and we responded. And we showed them British government reports, for example, on the role of Gaddafi in the NATO intervention in 2011, and how our intervention had made that worse, and those kind of things, and so but basically it was the piece that we did was scotched from the top for very political reasons. Now, I definitely don't want to make too big a thing of that, because that happens all the time. And it happens for all sorts of reasons as well. And sometimes it is, just the piece isn't quite right for one reason or another. And sometimes it's for politics. It might be it's too left wing, it might be it's too right wing, it might be whatever. So I'm not having a go particularly at the conversation, which is no different really from what I can see editorially to many of these other newspapers, including the Guardian, Independent, and all the rest of them. But it was just quite kind of stark and interesting how clear that case was, and that's partly because we have that shared software where you can see literally what's happening all the time. From the way it's edited, and it was particularly ironic and particularly notable and interesting that literally we had been doing a piece about what the mainstream media will not allow in, and so from that we wrote a very kind of early piece about what had happened with the article. Even though there's a story there, a kind of a more dramatic story about editorialization, that also didn't get in any newspaper. But eventually, I did a version that was a very much kind of super polished up version a few weeks ago for the Grey Zone. But it had got into various different things on the alternative media quite some time before that. So, but I was kind of happy with that, and I did feel like it was a good reflection of the propaganda model in action.
The reason that I wanted to talk about understanding mass media is because people who come to understand MMT a little bit and find it to be quite urgent, they get frustrated and confused as to why it gets the treatment that it does get in the media. And just because you're kind of new to it, Matthew, I'll just run through one of the big insights is that the governments like ours in the UK and the US and many other places in the world, these governments issue their own currency, and that means that they spend money into existence. That's what it means and they do that when they vote to do something that costs money. So the moment the Parliament votes to build a new hospital or buy a piece of military hardware or hire a bunch of nurses or soldiers, once that legislation passes, the spending is going to happen. The Bank of England can't countermand it or anything like that. There's nothing that can happen that can stop that. And so the money's voted into existence by Parliament and spent into existence by the government, instructing the Bank of England to mark up the bank balances of the recipients of the spending. So for all intents and purposes, the government creates new money whenever it spends rather than recycling money collected through taxation. Taxation is essential to create a demand for the currency, to make it worth something. You need to pay your taxes in pounds, which means you've got to earn pounds, rather than Bitcoin or seashells or gold. But the government, because it's the issue of pounds, has to spend them first in the sequence of things in order for people to have any money to pay taxes with in the first place, which is kind of a sort of mind-blowing thing for a lot of people. And of course, it completely invalidates any argument for austerity that's based on this 100% false idea that the government can run out of money. So anyway, those of us that have been learning about this and advocating progressive policies, we often come to this question that many activists get to. And that question is, look, we know this thing is true and we've got scholarly research, we've got solid evidence. Why does the media, particularly the nominally left-wing media, either report on it as if it's A, still under debate, as in the case of climate change, or B, as if it's low priority, as in the case of NHS privatization, or often they use, as you just outlined, they use the most powerful tactic of all, which is just not reporting on something. The answers are always, to me, are always revealed by Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky's propaganda model. So should we just start out with an overview of what it is?
The propaganda model by Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky, Edward Herman being a economist, Chomsky being a linguist, comprises a series of 5 what they call filters, but you could just see them as factors, really, just things that determine determine the content that comes out of from newspapers and from the rest of the media. And those things are the concentration of ownership among media conglomerates, the prevalence of advertising, meaning that advertisers are always going to play an important role, they're always going to be at the back of the mind of media institutions whenever they're producing content. The importance of official sources, which basically means that whatever story anyone is doing, however awful the government is within that story, you're still going to go to the government and say, "What's your view on this?" The fourth factor being flack, which is the idea that the more powerful you are as an organization or indeed an individual, the more you are able to defend your interests in the media, so the less the media is going to want to offend you. And then the fifth filter is a kind of broader idea of the importance of ideology, a kind of central mobilizing ideology. And the one that they originally talked about was the unifying ideology of anti-communism. Herman and Chomsky since kind of updated that to talk about the importance of an anti-other or a pro-free market, pro-neoliberal ideology.
Yeah, and sometimes they're described as anti-terrorism as well. That was more kind of Bush era, wasn't it? Just like, you're not with us, you're with the terrorists. That was the them and us that they carved out back then. One of the central things to it that helps me understand it is, and it's something that people say a lot these days, and they think they've just invented it. People often say, "Oh, if you haven't paid for the newspaper, you're the product. I've just figured this thing out about Twitter. Oh, you don't pay for it, so you're the product." Chomsky, and then even before Chomsky, Alex Carey, I think they were building on the work of an Australian called Alex Carey, had figured this out, that the actual customers of the newspaper are the advertisers. And even though you may pay a cover price to buy The Guardian or The Observer or The Independent or whatever, the main money is coming from advertisers. So the newspaper is selling your attention to the advertisers. The product is eyeballs.
I mean, that's the explanatory element of the propaganda model. But the predictive element, which is perhaps just as pertinent and interesting, is that there will be lots of debate about topics, ferocious debate they talk about, but within relatively narrow ideological lines, which means that there are things that are left out on the margins which are basically not engaged, like the things we're talking about. And so the model attempts to explain and predict that.
What I like about it is it sort of identifies the problem as a structural problem. The structure of a system, and systems can be changed rather than journalists are liars. And then that sets up an unhelpful us and them type thing. And, I'd like to, see journalists with a backbone a bit more often. But, the point is, you're watching Andrew Marr because the version of Andrew Marr that showed a bit of backbone would have been filtered out. He's internalized a story where he's a brave, no-nonsense person. And I don't know if you saw that moment where, he interviewed Chomsky and he says to Chomsky, no one tells me what to say. And Chomsky says something like, yeah, you're in the position you're in because they don't need to tell you what to say.
Yeah, it was one of the greatest mic drop moments.
Yes.
and Andrew Marr's brain floating out of his own head at that time. It's the only way he could cope psychologically with his entire existence.
Media Lens, who do a lot of work around analysing the media and then also getting people to engage with journalists in a polite, non-aggressive way. One of the co-founders, David Edwards, had a book called Free to Be Human years ago. And he described a way of thinking about the propaganda model by using this analogy, which I've got the book here, so I'm just going to point it out, which I really quite like. At first sight, it seems extraordinary that snowflakes and other snowflake has a different connotation these days. This is back in the 90s. All right, let me start again. At first sight, it seems extraordinary that snowflakes and other crystalline structures are able to form almost perfect symmetrical shapes in the absence of conscious control or design. The mechanism by which this occurs can easily be demonstrated by setting out a flat box-like framework on a table. By pouring a stream of tiny balls over this frame, we find that we eventually and inevitably end up with a more or less perfect pyramid shape, because the most stable resting position in the structure, given the square framework and the spherical shape of the balls, is always one that contributes to the construction of a perfect pyramid. Any ball that settles inevitably builds, while all the others in less stable positions are moved into more stable positions or bounce out. So no one is designing the pyramid or forcing the balls into place. The pyramid is simply an inevitable product of the framing conditions of round objects falling onto a square wooden frame. So I quite like that metaphor, because that frame, it's always going to create a pyramid. And if you don't want a pyramid, attacking the balls for not having the backbone to form a different shape isn't going to get you a different shape. Or you need to look at the framing conditions and recognize they're always going to produce the same outcome. And so you need to work on changing those framing conditions if you want to get a different outcome. And I think it also helps us be a bit more compassionate towards journalists themselves, which I think is good. I think when you go after the thing the journalist made rather than the journalist herself, it's going to force the journalist to respond to the issue rather than the tone.
I think that's right, yeah, and I completely agree with that. I suppose I would, with that kind of systematic, structural analysis, that kind of framework, it can be a little bit totalizing. It can be a little bit sort of over predictive. So there are changes that happen all the time. In fact, Herman and Chomsky point them out all the time. Or to take your example of your metal balls, someone, it only takes one of those balls to heat up or blow up or fall off or whatever it is to actually create an avalanche, or to have a significant impact on the way that thing is structured. So. That's perhaps slightly. I know I slightly nitpick about the propaganda model, but
it's a model.
It's a model, and models are just sort of ways of looking at the world. But there comes a point where it's like, okay, it's time to move on from just one way of looking at the world. I think for me, I kind of. I still advocate the model, and I think it's extremely useful as part of teaching or discussion, but I'm not sure a great deal more can be said about it from a research perspective. I sort of applied it to Hollywood, and that was useful. But even after that, after a few years of working on that, it was hard to know quite where to go with it. That's why the last probably 5 to 10 years, really, certainly the last 5 or 6 years of my research has been much more about actual archival work, looking at what does the CIA and the Pentagon do to film scripts? How do these organizations shape discourse? What kind of things are going on behind the scenes, the sort of specifics of it. So I 100% behind the model. Maybe 100% is the wrong way of putting it, particularly when you're talking about a model. You don't want to get your maths wrong. I'm very much behind the model. But I guess I think in the case of MMT, it's like I'm not quite sure what form of words I'd use to say how ideas like that are marginalized by the propaganda model. The propaganda model it can be applied to domestic issues, to economic issues. It's typically been applied in terms of foreign policy, and I kind of find it easier to apply to foreign policy because there are such stark cases over the past 50 years, or even perhaps a little bit longer, where there are such clear winners, such clear losers, such clearly sympathetic victims, and such clear, these whole peoples are either completely worthless or they are completely evil, or however, and that system has worked extremely effectively. But for other ideas beyond foreign policy, I feel that the model itself doesn't really break down. There's nothing wrong with the model, but I'm not sure how useful it is in explaining the absence of particular ideas.
There's a thing that I know that Chomsky talks about, and I think I've heard Pilger use this term, which is this type of commentator in the media known as a fig leaf.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm very interested in those. And I think they play a big part both in the propaganda model itself, but also in economics coverage as well. When I think of a fig leaf, I think about Owen Jones, George Monbiot, Mehdi Hassan. So they're kind of like moral weather vanes that sort of blow in the wind a little bit. They're largely right on most of the time, but then they're happy to throw certain leftists or left causes under the bus when necessary. So they make media consumers feel like they're listening to a fierce critic of the status quo, but then they're often here to police that leftward limit on thought, and then therefore the leftward limit on policy options.
Yeah, I agree, and I'd be interested to know how they or people like that have engaged in the economic side. But just as a slight callback to what we were talking about earlier about how quite small things can have large effects. I think that Owen Jones's lack of support for Corbyn at a really crucial point probably did there's probably a few you could account for his impact on a few thousand or a few tens of thousand votes to at least to some extent, and I think that was a real shame. It's a real pity that he was like that at that time, even if he then did kind of come round.
And basically the propaganda model says, the version of Owen Jones who wasn't going to do that wouldn't end up working at The Guardian.
Yes.
That's how you get on at The Guardian.
Again, about the propaganda model, there are all sorts of reasons why people might still be bloody awful at journalism other than these structural issues, these sort of mechanistic issues. People may have got psychological problems, or they just, they've got a particular beef because of their relationship with their bloody dad or whatever. All sorts of crazy reasons why people might not do it. But also then these other things, these very powerful overarching reasons why, like you say, a whole other organisation may not criticise an individual because they might want them on their show or whatever. Those things are just part of a kind of, you get a community, and it's not surprising that communities want to kind of support each other.
You say that, but I think the idea is it's I.F. Stone that said, look, I don't want to be friends with the people I'm reporting on. I don't want to go and play croquet with them on the lawn at the White House, because I want to be able to, give it to them with both barrels when they screw up. So it's like, well, okay, well, how close do you want to get to the people you need to be criticizing?
It's almost just like there are certain things that just drop off the radar because it doesn't do anyone any good to have them out there, except possibly these small pockets of victims who have been horribly abused. But a lot of the time those horribly abused victims are, it's just 120,000 people in Yemen who are who've been killed in such a thing, or it's people in Syria, and it's people at the margins who are often the ones who are suffering the most, but also have got the least reason why the mainstream would engage and support their cause, and lots of reasons to, more reasons than even the propaganda model would suggest. Every reason under the sun says why rock the boat.
And I think a thing that MMT can give to activists in Britain who are against, say, the arms trade, there's an idea out there that, if we stop selling arms to Saudi Arabia so that they can, be brutal in Yemen or whatever, if we stop doing that, well, we're going to lose a load of money. And it's like, no, actually, we don't need money from Saudi Arabia to fund our NHS or the things that we like. That's not how it works. The money's spent into existence first. If you're a state, the way you should think about spending is think about it costs, but it doesn't cost money. It costs resources. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you've got labor and materials making those arms. When you export them, you've used your labor, your materials, and then you've sent them somewhere else for somebody else to consume. So it actually represents a loss to the economy in real terms, in real things. So it actually doesn't help. We're not in that position of needing to grow like that.
So let me ask you a question then. So do you think that the propaganda model can explain why that idea isn't popular? Or isn't mainstream, or is it just simply, or is it simply some other factors? So, for example, it's just really hard for people to get their head around that, or is it a problem with education, or a problem with, maybe it's the way we teach maths or something like that? What is the actual thing there, or is it all of the above and several other things as well?
Yeah, I would go for that last one. I think it's all of the above and several other things, but it's all. But I would also, if you think about it, what I just said to you, a few minutes ago about the pounds for the UK government. Pounds originate with the UK government. They're not collected from some outside entity by the UK government to get spent. And people, it's very jarring. Our whole experience of money is you have to get it before you can spend it. We cannot conceive that there is an entity out there that emits pounds. But that is the case. That's what fiat currency means. It's issued. So you have to ask what legal entity is, because it is a legal construct, what legal entity is issuing these pounds? And then once you work it back, then you've got all these other implications about it. So I would say it's a little bit like basically the cleverest people in the world at one time thought that the Earth was the center of the universe, right? And that the sun was orbiting it. And somebody discovered, no, it's not. In fact, it's exactly the opposite. We're orbiting the sun. And, if you imagine the trouble that person had convincing, because basically the cleverest people on Earth were saying, no, we've written all the scholarship about it. We've got the texts and we know this. And, overturning something like that it doesn't go down easy, because there are all these structural imperatives. People have built careers on a lot of the complicated models that were built on the old way of thinking about how money comes into being. Even say Paul Krugman and people that you think are these sort of progressive economists, they basically accept all the traditional economic models, but they just say, but we should still be nicer. A little bit like your sort of anti-austerity centrist, like, the government can run out of money, but even so, we should do austerity, but just do it nicer. And MMT and post-Keynesian thought, which is carrying on what Keynes thought, is going, actually, no, we don't have to do austerity at all. And we say it's a political choice. And when we say that, people go, yeah, I get it. The government are choosing to not spend the money on, choosing to allocate their scarce money in ways that are creating poverty and death. And it's like, no,
it's not even that.
It's not even that. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So
but presumably you can have a strong allyship with people like Paul Krugman, and probably more so perhaps than you could with Owen Jones, because even if they may disagree on the kind of fundamental concept, I don't know. I think from my perspective,
you'd be interested to know that Paul Krugman takes every opportunity he gets to attack MMT.
Oh, that's
because they've all got reputation.
Because people are so territorial, aren't they?
Yeah.
It's just horrendous. And
exactly. Yeah. And
I was about to be enthusiastic for this final section of this thing, and then I was like, oh no, I've got emotional now. It's very annoying, like that, because I kind of believe that you can make an alliance of kind of nice people on, say, foreign policy would be a good case, kind of civilized people. When I was growing up, my first kind of political experiences were we fixed the ozone layer. We got rid of apartheid in South Africa, and we ended the Cold War. I mean, I don't think it would take a great deal to do something similar with, as happened with the ozone layer, to fix a lot of these problems with climate change. But because all societies have become so atomized, and all nations have become so much less solidarity between nations over the last 30 years for lots of reasons, but probably largely related, I think, whether people sort of recognize it or not, to do with the collapse of socialism. But because of that, it seems so much harder. But actually, I think, we could quite easily, within mainstream ideology and within mainstream discourse, end the species survival threats in a matter of, that could be sorted out in a few months.
Well, we nearly did. Well, we nearly did, didn't we? When we went on lockdown.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, basically, let's just do more of that. We know, this is where MMT comes into it, or kind of understanding the money system, because people will go, oh, well, look, we'd love to have everybody have a unicorn and stay at home and not pollute, but, we've got to make money. And it's like, well, actually, we choose what is valuable. The government definitely chooses what is valuable.
I do remember thinking exactly the same thing. But yeah, like you say, sometimes it's not actually that easy because of just the way that people are so territorial. And the more you're into a topic, oftentimes it can be that the more territorial you are about that particular way of thinking. That's why I think that's why one of the reasons I try and be a little bit distant myself from the propaganda model.
Oh, sure. I just think it's worth internalizing the propaganda model.
Yes, exactly.
You know what I mean? Just so it helps you. Media Lens a while ago put out a media alert. Within it, the writers, David and David, said something like, we get people asking us all the time, what should we do? Should we just like throw away The Guardian, The Independent, the nominally progressive press? And their answer at that time, it might have changed now, I don't know, but was, no, we're giving you the missing context so that you could read between the lines. So you can still have a look at this stuff, but you could get a fuller picture of why people are saying what they're saying. In recent times, people like Laura Kuenssberg have been so overtly basically a PR machine for the government and PR machine for the establishment. It's quite hard to give people like that a sympathetic reading, I think, these days. But back then when they wrote that, I was like, yeah, that's right. You need to just see the fuller picture.
Absolutely. But then trying to do something about it that doesn't drive you crazy.
Yeah.
That is part of the joy of your life in as best you can. Because it's so easy to burn out doing anything like this.
Well, that kind of brings me to, how I was going to sort of move into the home straight, which was to say that, when people get this stuff, that, the mass media is not here to help and no one's coming, people often become makers of their own media. Given that on the individual level, what we can do is build networks so that we're a little less individual and more of an us. And given that we like to make, or we feel what's available to us as a step we can take is to make media, make blogs, make videos. As somebody that's made impactful things, documentary films and stuff that have been designed to change people, do you have any advice to give to people who are trying to make things, to make change?
I guess one thing I'd say is don't expect too much of yourself or of anyone else, but just do what you quite like doing anyway. If you like making songs, and you think that that can somehow tie into putting across a message, then maybe do. Or if you if you like teaching, or if you like making board games and you want to do it, design around, whatever it is, it could be anything. Or if you like being an accountant, and maybe you could go and help some kind of organisation that's doing something. Whatever skill that you've got, whatever time that you've got, I think people can be useful and interesting, but useful. But I think that it's best if you try and do the thing that will work for you. In my case, I quite like sort of telling stories, and so I felt I could do something with that in a couple of documentaries. I felt I could be of use. Mm-hmm. But I think also I wouldn't want to be too kind of pious or anything like that, because ultimately I think probably the reason that I do those political things, or at least have done something along with political things, is just that I like, it was partly, at least largely, that I like processing information like that. I like stories. I like that kind of thing. The moral side of it, there is something there, and it is, I think it's important to do that, but I don't think you should put yourself under too much pressure. I knew this band once who were really, really good, and they were kind of like a rap band. And they really had it together, and then they stopped. And I asked the guy why he stopped, and he said something like, I think he ended up working in a pub, sort of long term. And he basically said, well, couldn't really have an effect. And I thought that was such a shame, really, because that's it. That is true. They probably couldn't have an effect. They weren't going to stop the Iraq War. You know what I mean? But they were still doing something. And if you just keep that enjoyment with it, then you keep loose with it, and you try and enjoy it in whatever way, then I think that's all you can really expect of yourself.
I think you've nailed it there. The reason why that person got dispirited is because they kind of let somebody else set the goalposts for them.
Yes.
They let somebody else into their head. And this happens all the time if you go to demonstrations and, you march against the Iraq war on Saturday and then they start bombing on Monday and people go, look, you failed. And it's like, no. Yeah. We didn't think we were going to march on Saturday and they would call off the war.
Yes.
It's about building consciousness, and as it turns out, actually, that was the first war to be protested before it happened.
I went to the Occupy things a while ago, and someone came out and said exactly that. It's like, what's the point in you doing this? Because it didn't stop the Iraq war. And I said, well, it might have stopped the Iran war.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
he quite liked that answer. Yeah. But I'm not the greatest activist or anything like that, and I don't have those.
But again, you need to take your own medicine. Why should you be the greatest activist?
No, yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think you got to pace yourself a little bit with these things as well. But I'd say that and whether you call this cynical or a more positive thing, I'm not sure. But I certainly feel that that one of the reasons I've continued to be able to engage politically in life is because, and I don't want to say because I don't take it too seriously, because that's not quite it. And that's very flippant, but I would say that I have seen the entertainment in it. It is enjoyable to see the way that stories go and to try and make narratives out of things. It is enjoyable to engage in music and comedy that relates to your interest, whether you agree with that or whether you agree with the actual message of it or not. And that's the way to kind of stay loose with it a bit. And I think that can at least mean that you're engaged, and that means that when there is a protest on, or when there is something that you can do practically that can be genuinely of help to somebody, then you're going to be in a position to do that well.
Yeah. Maybe an overarching theme to what you're saying there is find your passion and then fold your activism into your passion.
Yeah, not the other way. Probably not the other way around. Unless you are someone who is, unless you're someone who actually just loves going out with a placard and going nuts in the street, or gluing themselves to a train or something. Yeah, but maybe it is.
In that case, you are still folding your passion.
Yeah, you're still. Yeah. That is your hobby.
I'm quite kinky, so if I'm going to handcuff myself to anything, I may as well.
Exactly.
May as well save the planet while I'm doing it.
Yes.
I just often come down to, look, if you can talk to one other person and have them understand one little thing about it, you've kind of just doubled the size of people that are interested in it. Obviously don't hit them over the head and say, you must be interested in this because I'm interested in this. But, when people do say things like, well, God, where's all the money coming from for, this COVID, to pay people to stay at home, to stop the spread of COVID or something, some of those people are genuinely going, where does money come from? And they would be interested in the answer. So if you can find just one other person, you've doubled the number of people today that understood it in your sphere of influence. Start where you are, I think, and don't think that you're going to create some piece of online content it's not like blowing up the Death Star. You're not going to drop it in there and then the whole thing changes, I'm
going to ask you a question which slightly cocks up your attempt, I think, to run this, to run into the home straight and finish this podcast. I would say that underlying what I want in the international system, the reason that I want a fairer media or a more honest media, blah, 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 I would say that it's probably about the desire to see greater human happiness, or at least less suffering. So what is that the motivation behind MMT? Because then there can be, it doesn't matter particularly which way you go with that, but I suppose when you're trying to promote an idea, when you're trying to make the world better, there may not just be one way of making the world better. The fundamental underlying idea might be MMT, or it might be media reform, or whatever it might be. But ultimately, if the idea is to reduce suffering, then you can kind of be doing that in lots of ways that aren't always focused on one particular thing.
Yeah, but I totally agree with it, which is kind of why I'm trying to sort of draw together two ideas here. I think the reason that a lot of us end up looking at economics is because all of those things that not you, but one goes, hey, if this changed, this would be an unambiguous public good. And what happens is somebody turns around and goes, yeah, but how are you going to pay for that? That is the biggest enemy of any progressive policy initiative you want to throw out there. Right? Green New Deal. The planet's burning. We won't have an inhabitable planet for human life. Yeah, I mean, we'd like to do something about it, but how are we going to pay for it? I think this is why people get very passionate about MMT when they get it. It's like the government spends by saying, spend the money. It doesn't need to get it from Elon Musk. The government has infinite dollars. The US government has infinite dollars. The UK government has infinite pounds. So if you are really bothered about trying to stop the planet burning to death, because everybody's there going, rah, rah, yeah, we totally agree with the objectives of Extinction Rebellion and Greenpeace and stuff. But the money, think about the money. And it's like, yeah, we have thought about the money. and we can do it. And then people go, well, won't taxes need to go up, or won't this inflate the currency so much that it'll become worthless? And you kind of need to have answers for that. But really, it's born out of basically being able to answer those people who stand in the way of your progressive agenda by saying, well, money will run out if we do this thing that I totally agree, we should totally do it, but we just can't afford it. And it's like, no, we can absolutely afford it.
It's absolutely such a fulcrum point. You think that it's it would lay the foundations for an infinitely better international society, basically.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Before we say goodbye, Matthew, where can people stay current with your work?
On Facebook, if you go to The Writer with No Hands, which is the name of an old documentary project that, actually I say old, I'm doing myself down again there.
Exactly. We're not talking about the 60s here.
Yeah, it's a fairly contemporary documentary project that I was involved with. So go to facebook.com / The Writer with No Hands, and that's where I kind of post every day or two about these kind of issues, things like I talk a lot about war, and I talk a lot about propaganda, and I talk a lot about things like assassination and other forms of entertainment. So that's where I put out most of my material, and we've got a documentary film coming out about the manipulation by the CIA and Pentagon of Hollywood film scripts. That'll be out by the end of the year, and that's a sort of that's a team effort, which I think may be of interest.
I've been reading National Security Cinema, which is one of your books, available at all evil online retail outlets.
Available at one evil online outlet because we self-published it.
We'll remain nameless. But you kind of have to read it to believe it. But just looking at it with the propaganda model in the background, it really is that pillar of the propaganda model about access. You know, if you're going to be critical of the government, then you're not going to get access to the government, and you need them as a source. It's pretty much mirrored in the way that Hollywood filmmakers relate to the Pentagon. You know, they need their hardware and they need all that stuff. So the Pentagon, in exchange, do a kind of quid pro quo. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's is fair to say. And I guess what's interesting about it is that whereas broadly speaking, the propaganda model looked like it always applied to all things. You know, propaganda model can apply to a crossword, for God's sake, you know, a puzzle book. A propaganda model can kind of apply to pornography. A propaganda model kind of applies to Hollywood and applies to the news and so on. But what was interesting is that really until we did this work, it didn't look like it specifically applied in that sourcing filter or factor. It just didn't seem very important. The role of the Pentagon and of other governmental organizations just did not seem to be, I mean, people knew that it happened in the 20th century, but it seems so insignificant. You know, just a couple of hundred products may be affected in some way, you know, by some sort of chats with the military or whatever. But we've shown that it's many times larger than that. Maybe 10 times larger, but quite possibly much more even than that, depending how you want to measure it. If you take all the individual episodes of TV shows going back to the 50s, but particularly escalating over the last 20 years, the rise of cable TV, there's just an enormous number of films and TV shows that are basically so heavily influenced that the government not just the government, but security organizations within the government, Pentagon, CIA, and then to some extent FBI, and NSA, and all, if you add up all the police departments as well, and local states, and how they affect these scripts. You know, it's affected thousands of scripts. And
it's almost like they should be given a writing credit to some of the things you lay out there.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely crazy, really. But yeah, I mean, we totted up the figures again, and this was just a few months ago because we were doing it for the documentary. But we think that actually we can name over 10,000 scripts that have been impacted in a serious way. But even of the relatively of the case studies that we look at, just the obvious ones, Black Hawk Down and all that kind of thing. The depth of the changes that are made by the government are just so severe that that sourcing filter is just way more important than anyone ever thought. And it almost amounts, it's the kind of thing, like the idea that if you said in the 1980s or 90s or even beyond, it's like, hey man, like I think the military's controlling the TV. It's like, it would be something you said if you're stoned out of your mind. And it just strikes me that it's one of those things that was like the craziest conspiracy theory, and we've proved it. And we've proved it with just Freedom of Information Act. Right. Although there's still about 240,000 pages of documentation just from the Navy, which have not yet been released, and it costs money. And
they haven't been released because some enterprising individual snapped them up and won't let you look at them, right?
That's a slightly different thing you're thinking of. That's a historian called Lawrence Seward, who he basically did do that. With all of the Pentagon material. So he effectively kept hold of that from the 1970s until well into the 2000s without showing anyone else. So basically he did not share all of the documentation that would make this story come alive for, God knows, whatever it was, 40 plus years. And then even when he did, it was only to an individual journalist for a very short period of time, who then immediately fell out with him. It wasn't until Lawrence Seward died about 3 years ago that the system really began to open up. That's just a case of a historian just being mean and unhelpful. But one of the reasons he was mean and unhelpful was because he was really close to the institution of the American military. He was pretty good friends with them. But what I'm saying is that there remain hundreds of thousands of pages of documentation. We just don't quite know whether that would how much more information that would open up. But we do know that it exists. It may just be repetitive. I don't. No, that's me being sort of doing things down a little bit. But we just don't know what's in that 240,000 pages. And then there's also the Marines, and the Marines tell us that they've got boxes of rejected scripts stacked up from floor to ceiling. So that's quite interesting as well. Like, just the things that are just never made, that no one's ever heard of, because, there was some big project that some famous such and such was attached to, but they didn't make it because the Marines didn't like it. Yeah, it just happens all the time, and it's just an absolutely massive thing, massive scandal. And that's one of the reasons why, when we did that book in 2017, we did.
That was years ago.
Yeah, yeah.
I can't believe you're bringing that up.
But people snapped it up. They're like, people still buy that book without any advertising, any endorsements, nothing. We just put it out because we thought it was important to have the documents out in the public domain. But people responded to it because they could see, just from reading around it, just from reading the title and the basic blurb that we put out, that it was a really important story, and it was basically breaking this kind of conspiracy, really. That's it's an institutional kind of power structure. But most people would consider it to be a conspiracy, really.
Yeah. I think there's a difference between a conspiracy and a conspiracy theory, right? This is like,
yes.
Conspiracies are real. Yeah. So, I think before we go, it might be worth just saying there are a few places, if people are interested in media activism, we've got Matthew is bringing these stories to light in his way, but we also have activist networks. We've talked about Media Lens a few times, and basically, if you're not already familiar, it's medialens.org. I think, but I'll link to that in the show notes. But one of the really valuable things they do is they encourage people to write to editors in a polite, non-aggressive way and sort of have a coordinated effort when something's being misrepresented in the media. And I think that's a good thing, so that you can make your point, have them take issue with your point rather than your tone. And in the States, in the US, there's Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, fair.org, and they have a similar thing. You can sign up for their Action Alert Network, where, when they you see something being misrepresented or just completely edged out of the news landscape. And I just wondered if you knew of any other types of things like that, Matthew, before we go?
There's Declassified UK, which is quite a new one, which I think only began in about 2019. And they specifically focus on British foreign policy. So I'd say along with fair.org, which focuses on the United States, and Media Lens, which focuses, on kind of Britain and America, really, Media Lens. I'd say that those are the three best media critical organizations that are worth knowing about.
Yeah. Okay, well, it's been great to talk to you, Matthew, and thanks for being so generous with your time.
Okay, lovely. Thank you very much for having me, Christian.
Take care, mate. That was the MMT podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Don't forget, you can support the show through Patreon, starting at $1 a month and get access to patron-only episodes. You can do that by going to patreon.com/MMT podcast. You can also find me on Twitter at MMT podcast, and you can find Patricia on Twitter at Patricia N. Pino, and you can email us at mmtpodcast@outlook.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope to hear from you.
So here's an annoying sort of question that might dogleg our discussion a little bit.
So I can edit it out.
Yeah. Yeah.